What's up? Here we go again. Third video of the morning. This kind of productivity doesn't just happen, kids. This is a gift. Okay, so our final response to the ills of classical liberal laissez-faire. This is the big one. This is where we see classical liberalism switch over to modern liberalism. This is where we see a redefinition of what liberalism actually is. So let's check this out. So FDR and the New Deal. Why does it matter? Well, it matters, as I mentioned, because this is where we see the birth of the modern liberal welfare state. So in the top right-hand corner there, you can see a picture of President Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And as it says, guys, the New Deal was a response to the suffering in America caused by the Great Depression. The Great Depression changed things immeasurably in the United States of America. So while he was running for president, to become the president in 1932, FDR was a Democrat, so he's on the left side of the spectrum. He promised a New Deal for the American people. Now, as it says here, guys, the welfare state is born with the modern liberal state. So we now see the beginning of what we commonly talk about as the welfare state. Now it was the job of the state to remove that misery in society and make people's lives better. If you remember from classical liberal laissez-faire, they did not believe that. The role of the government was to simply protect life, liberty, property at a very minimal level and ensure those things. And then beyond that, it really had no role during classical liberal laissez-faire. However, with modern liberalism, we see the birth of the social safety net. So the state now provides for people who fall through the cracks of society. And with this, guys, we see the size of the state continually expand, and get much, much larger. Now, critics of the welfare state typically refer to it as the nanny state. We know the term nanny state is a pejorative term that people on the right, neoconservatives who believe in principles of classical liberalism, they see the welfare state as the nanny state because they see it as too intrusive, too large. Now, what ultimately was the reason for this redefinition of liberalism? And the answer here, folks, is the Great Depression. Now, before the Great Depression, of course, we had, so before the 1930s, oddly enough, we had the 1920s. The 1920s were this amazing time of economic growth in the United States of America. The economy was booming. It was absolutely booming at this time. And during the Roaring '20s, the optimism of America was boundless. Now, why was the American economy booming in the 1920s? Well, it's actually pretty simple. Before the 1920s comes the 1910s. From 1914 to 1918, part of that decade, of course, we see World War I. World War I destroyed the productive capacity of Europe. However, America filled in that gap. America became the supplier of all the things needed by Europe until Europe had rebuilt and brought their production capacity back online once again. So from 1920 till about 1928, America was the greatest place to live in the world. However, by 1928, 1929, we see that drastically change. Now, this chart that we have here, we can see the economy of the 1920s continually going up and up and up and up. And then we hit this thing called Black Tuesday. Black Tuesday was October 29th, 1929. This is considered to be, by most historians, the beginning of the Great Depression, right? This is where everything started to come tumbling down. And as you can see, it continued to go down and down and down and down. And just if we had a larger scale for the bottom axis here, this would continue on and on and on and on until about 1939. 1939, of course, we get World War II. And really, that's what helps the American economy come out of the Great Depression. That being said, however, FDR and the New Deal did transform things in America. The New Deal programs and the different measures taken by the American government at this time was thought to have reduced unemployment by a factor of about 10 to 15%. It didn't end it all, but it did definitely make it better. So the boom and the bust, that's what we just saw in that last slide, right? So the boom is where the economy is going up, and then the bust is where it is going down. And we talked about why that happened. So when you combine, America's productive capacity with the fact that in the 1920s, America was hooked up to the power grid, the car became a consumer good, things like vacuums and refrigerators, the radio, it was an amazing time to be an American. Now, with that, people started spending a lot of money. And this was where we first see the use of credit as an economic idea. People, to be honest, overextended themselves. When times are good, people think the good times will never end. However, when they do, that's when it all comes tumbling down. So how did the Great Depression happen? So first of all, guys, we need to differentiate between a depression and a recession. A recession is a temporary, if this is the economy going up, a recession kind of has it blip down and then it goes back up. So it is temporary and it's not that severe. Recessions don't last a long time and they're not that severe. It is the economy going down, but it's not for a long time. However, a depression, the economy is going up, 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 as we saw in the last slide, and then it goes down and stays down for an extended period of time. As I spoke about before, basically the entirety of the 1930s is what we think of as the Great Depression. And this downturn in the economy, which started in America, spreads to other economies in the world. So with the stock market crash, October 29th, 1929, Black Tuesday, this begins a series of events which just destroy the economy of America, with America being the largest economy in the world. That then causes a ripple effect to many economies throughout the world as well. And to be honest, we're starting to see that with the COVID-19 pandemic that we're living in. So it says, stocks begin to drop because of European recovery, right? American companies were doing great in the 1920s up until about 1928, 1929. Stocks then start to drop because American companies aren't as profitable, because European economies have rebuilt. People see stocks drop, they begin to worry, and panic starts to set in. When panic starts to set in, people try to sell their stock. When we see a selling of stock, that then causes the value of the stock to go down based on the dictates of supply and demand. When people who have still held their stocks see their stocks go down, that causes more panic. And then that causes those people to sell their stock, and it goes on and on and on. As the value of the stock market starts to drop, people begin to think that the economy is going to tank. That causes people to stop spending money. When people stop spending money, people aren't needed at jobs anymore, just like what we're seeing right now with the COVID-19 crisis. People aren't going out, going to dinner, buying cars, any of those kinds of things. That then causes people to get laid off. So it's actually kind of amazing how a lot of what caused the Great Depression, we are seeing it right now with the COVID-19 pandemic. And in the end, guys, what really causes an economic slowdown is lack of confidence and panic. And at the bottom of this slide, there is a video embedded there, and it tells you where to watch it from. I believe the video should start at the 44-minute and 10-second mark, and then watch it to about 49 minutes. All right, so how does America start to get out of this calamity known as the Great Depression? Well, that's where FDR comes in. So in 1932, FDR, Democrat, runs against Herbert Hoover, who's a Republican. As a Republican, Herbert Hoover believes in laissez-faire. He believes in self-help. And FDR wins the presidency, it should actually say in 1932. So in November 1932, there's a presidential election. FDR wins. And then once he's inaugurated in 1933, January, he begins this thing called the New Deal. He promised this New Deal to the American people, so he was just keeping his promise. So between 1933 and 1938, there's actually 2 New Deals, and if you watch the video at the bottom of the screen right here, they will talk about it, but collectively we'll just call it the New Deal. Now, what did the New Deal focus on? Well, we talk about the 3 R's of the New Deal: relief, recovery, and reform. Basically, what it wanted to do, guys, is make things better, right? So relief for the unemployed and poor. Unemployment rates in America shot up to about 25%. 1 in every 4 people was unemployed, and that then, of course, leads to poverty, homelessness, and all sorts of problems. Recovery of the economy back to normal levels. How are we going to do this? Well, we're going to start these things called alphabet agencies, and you'll see that, or you should have seen that previously on a slide. Or actually, I think it's in the Keynesian economic slide after this one, or sorry, the module after this one. And then we have reform of the financial system. Many of these banks that collapsed during the early days of the Great Depression were rather unregulated. So FDR and the New Deal, it introduces regulation so that, you know, these banks can't fail. They can't give out risky loans, and all these new economic measures are introduced into the American system. So yeah, and ultimately, guys, they were very, very effective. Now, the Electoral Map of the, should say again, 1932 election shows that FDR basically swept this election, with the exception of, you know, 6 or so states. FDR won by a landslide. Now, quick little summary of the New Deal. I mean, guys, think about this. In the early 1900s, we saw the change to communism in the nation of Russia. In the 1920s and 30s, we saw the rise of fascism in Italy. And then in the 1930s, we saw the rise of Nazism in Germany. But the state of America, which was going through a major crisis. I want you guys to think about this. You know, when times are good, that's where we see people generally cluster around the center of the economic and political spectrum. However, as times go bad, that's where we see people going out to the extremes, whether it's the far left or the far right. But guys, in America, the New Deal kept America liberal. It redefined what liberalism means, but nonetheless, they didn't sacrifice their freedoms. They didn't become a totalitarian state like in Italy or Germany, or even in the Soviet Union, which was existent at this time. Now, during his first 100 days in office, the so-called first 100 days. So presidents are often measured in terms of their effectiveness as far as the amount and the impact of the legislation that they pass within the first 100 days of their presidency. And within the first 100 days of FDR's presidency, he passes 15 major pieces of legislation. Now, why does this matter? Well, FDR commonly would come onto the radio and give his fireside chats. And in these chats, FDR spoke about how the problems that the American people face were no less their problem than they were the government's problems. He basically sold the idea that the government and the people were going to now walk hand in hand together and fight to make America better. So we get the birth of the modern liberal state. In this image here, we see an image of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, President Roosevelt, signing one of his many executive orders where he is able to just write laws as the executive branch of government in the American Republican system. He's able to bypass Congress and just make these laws become, you know, the lay of the land. Now, another thing that we see introduced by FDR, not during the New Deal, but I did want to bring this up, is this idea of a second Bill of Rights. When I think FDR, I think modern liberalism. Now, you can see on this particular slide that with this second Bill of Rights, it talks about how every American has a number of rights. So to things like a job, a decent house, medical care, a good education. So what FDR wanted to do, guys, during his presidency, and by the way, he served 4 terms. He's the last president to do so. After FDR, they pass a constitutional amendment that says that presidents can only serve 2 terms. But guys, what FDR is trying to do is redefine the role of government in American society. So if you recall, before FDR and modern liberalism, under the classical liberal ideal of laissez-faire, the role of government was to be very, very small. Now, government is expanding dramatically in its size and scope. So yeah, modern liberalism began with FDR. The welfare state began with FDR. Today, liberals believe the role of government is to be much, much larger. And that's something that people on the right, people who identify as neoconservatives, they disagree with, because they worry that if government gets too large, it has too much power over us. So some characteristics of the welfare state. So we see things like Social Security being woven into the fabric of the nation. So we see things like welfare payments, employment insurance, pensions. Citizens are provided with funds that they need in order to survive. Next, we see unionization. The left, modern liberals, are very friendly to unions, and they're believed to be good for middle-class people because, of course, as we've looked at already previously, unions, they give more to the average worker. Next welfare state characteristic would be that the welfare state is socialist in nature. So it's based on principles of equality, and it creates this equality through redistributive means, right? We take from the rich, we give to the poor in order to create that safety net that picks everybody up. Next characteristic, we see economic control and regulation. We see a lot of regulation in a modern liberal economy, right? It is rather socialist, or at least there's a lot more government involvement in the economy than what we had seen prior to FDR and the New Deal. What else do we see? We see the provision, right? The state is providing people with basic services, things like K through 12 education. Here in Alberta, of course, we have Alberta Education, which is a public educational ministry providing education for all Albertans. And we see this in every province across this great country called Canada. We see the provision of state-funded healthcare, right? We use tax dollars to create this system of healthcare, and it's provided for all people. We see public transportation, Strathcona County Transit, Edmonton Transit, ways to get people around. Subsidized housing. If you're poor, we see housing as a right for all people. All people have the right to shelter. So if you can't afford it, then the government will help you attain it. And in some welfare states, we even see free post-secondary education. Wouldn't that be nice? Wouldn't that be nice? So in like Germany and Argentina, the post-secondary education that most people attain is provided to them by government. Now, why would they do this? Why would the governments of Argentina or Germany actually provide this for people? Well, they believe that having an educated populace is in the best interest of the nation. And to be honest, I tend to agree with that. Smart people, you know the meme? Smart people are people who are innovative, and they are entrepreneurial, and they push the economy forward. People who lack technical skills don't have the capacity to do so. What else do we see? We see state ownership of industry. Here in Canada, when the state, right? The government owns industry. We call them crown corporations, and there's not a lot of them left. In the 1980s, and we'll look at this later on in the course, we see a mass amount of deregulation and privatization. But one of the few remaining crown corporations that exist today is Canada Post. Yeah, so guys, in a welfare or a modern liberal state, we see far more government involvement in the economy. What else do we see? High taxes, right? How are we going to provide all these things for people? Well, it has to come off the backs of somebody else, right? And this is one of the main arguments against the modern liberal state, right? In order to finance the lives of people, we have to take from the lives of other people. We also see regulation of employment as a characteristic of the welfare state. So to prevent exploitation of workers, we see legislation passed by governments to ensure security and welfare of all the workers. Things like maximum work hours, things like minimum wages. These are all characteristics of the welfare state. And the more we see nations accept these ideas, the more we can call them welfare states. So places like Norway, Sweden, Denmark, right? The socialist, democratic, Scandinavian nations of Europe, we typically think of them as welfare states. We could consider Canada to be a welfare state as well. I mean, probably not as far as the Scandinavian nations of the world, but definitely we in Canada are seen as being rather socialist, especially to our brothers and sisters down south. And in these states, we see a lot of government. The government's involved a lot in the lives of its people. And we also see things like environmental protection laws. Where there's a problem, the modern liberal state looks to fix those problems, right? So how do we fix those problems? We legislate. So a lot of legislating happens within modern liberal states. We also see the passage of like civil rights laws for women or minorities in society. And ultimately, we've also seen the expansion of the franchise. When we talk about the expansion of the franchise, we're talking about the expansion of voting rights to all people in society. And today, when we talk about nations like Canada, we talk about this idea of universal suffrage. The idea of universal suffrage means that all people in that society have the right to participate in politics. And at its most basic level, we do that through voting. Yeah, that's the end, guys. That's FDR's New Deal. That is the modern liberal welfare state. And I tell you what, with the crisis that we're going through right now, when I compare what I see here in Alberta, in Canada, versus what I see going on in the United States of America, maybe socialism isn't so bad. I think we're faring a lot better than our brothers and sisters down south right now. Anyways, yeah, I think that might be my last video of the day. If you have any questions, right, we'll have that question period here, and you can indeed ask them. If you have other questions, you can ask via email. So yeah, let me know if you need anything. Oh, by the way, Vortex, just so you guys are aware, you can see my hat right there. Vortex is a company that makes rifle scopes and other things like that. So if I haven't told you yet, make sure you get your gun licenses and stock up on ammo, because you never know. Okay, take it easy, guys. Peace. Have a good day. We'll talk later. Bye.